Shalom Lekulam. Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. And welcome to the Begin Center's English Zoom. It's a weekly event that we have here at this time on a Wednesday. We've been doing it now for a year and a half. It's funny, every week, actually, I've been saying we've been doing this since the outbreak of coronavirus. And now finally we are actually addressing that particular topic. We'll get to that in a second. I want to welcome those of you who are regulars and also newcomers. As usual, we have an audience from around the world, here in Israel, the United States, Canada, Europe. So welcome everybody. For those of you who are new to this, I'll just briefly explain the format. I'm going to talk to our guest for about half an hour, put some questions to him. We'll hear what he has to say, and then there'll be time for extensive time for you to put your questions to him. You can write those in the chat facility, the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can write those as they occur to you. I will be making a note of them and moderating them and putting them to our guest a bit later. I should also tell you that this event is being broadcast on our YouTube channel and recorded there. You can go to the Begin Center YouTube channel and see a whole series of our videos of previous Zoom events in Hebrew and English. This one will also be available if you have to leave early and miss some of it, or if you want to send it on to friends or family afterwards. Okay. Now, those of you who are regulars will know that we've been discussing over the past year and a half a whole host of issues relating to Israeli policy, contemporary policy, Israeli history, wider Jewish world issues, the wider Middle East, and all manner of things relating to politics and policy. And what we haven't really touched up to now is the policy area, which is perhaps the dominant headline, at least domestically in Israel, and indeed around the world for the past 2 years, the big elephant in the room, which is Covid, the coronavirus. And what I wanted to do, particularly with this audience of Israeli olim and people outside Israel, who in many cases have friends and family in Israel, I wanted to address this issue of what Israel is doing and has been doing with regard to Corona. Especially now, there's a lot of controversy around the policy of banning tourists. I'm sure we'll get to that. But we're going to take a deep dive with our guest today. I'm very delighted to have Arieh Kovler with us. Arieh is a writer, political analyst, and a communications consultant. He writes at Spectator and his own hat tip Substack. He's appeared on CNN, BBC, and other media to discuss politics, including COVID-19 policy. Some of you may be aware of him because he became a social media superstar about a year ago, just under a year ago, when he or just after the January 6th attack on the Capitol in Washington, D.C., when some news people in the United States discovered that Arieh had predicted exactly that event a week or so before on Twitter. And so he was a contributor to CNN and other news outlets during that period. But we're going to be talking to him about Corona. Sorry, I should also mention that, like myself, he's originally from the UK. And before making Aliyah, he was head of policy and research for the Jewish Leadership Council in Britain. Arieh, welcome.
Hi.
Good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so Arieh, you wrote a really great article about Israel's COVID policy for the Tel Aviv Review of Books. And actually, we'll put a link to that a bit later on in the chat for those that want to read that. But I want to just very briefly, you a little quote from that you wrote that Israel's management of the pandemic has spanned 3 governments, 2 elections, 3 lockdowns, and 4 waves of the virus, which says as much about Israel's crazy politics as anything else. But can you just give us just as a sort of broad general question, how would you define what Israel's doctrine has been for fighting COVID-19?
It's a very interesting question. I think there is an Israeli doctrine for fighting COVID-19 in a way that maybe some other countries don't have. Partly, I think there's a sense that Israel was very eager to be the first. There was a lot of praise of Israel bigging itself up, and successive governments, the first to do an early lockdown and keep COVID out during the first wave, the first to introduce green passes, the first to vaccinate, the first to do boosters. I think that some of that comes from the Israeli sort of startup nation, I'm not going to say startup nation mentality, but almost a meta mentality, a way in which Israel, and particularly Israeli leaders, like to think about ourselves as we are the scrappy, fast, nimble, problem-solving country who can deal with anything, resilient, tough. And I think that both the way Israel managed the pandemic and the way it talked about how it managed the pandemic to the world sort of linked to that Israeli sense. And I touched on something else there as well, which I think is a bit true. There is a sense of scrappy and nimble. Israel was not throughout this pandemic scared to take some quite dramatic steps. We had a fairly full lockdown very early on, when there was practically no COVID in the country. Our first virus wave was pretty moderate, but the restrictions we had were very strong, maybe more like the restrictions that people might be familiar with from Southeast Asia, where they had very strict coronavirus restrictions, than say Europe, which is or the Americas, where maybe Israel looks more often for its kind of cultural inspiration. We were one of the first countries to mandate masking, again, outside of Southeast Asia and Asia more generally. We were one of the first countries, I think the first, to introduce any kind of a vaccine passport. Partly that's because we were the first to vaccinate, nobody else could really do it. But there wasn't any shyness in it. In the UK, they only really introduced any sort of vaccine passport just a couple of weeks ago, even though they started vaccinating a year ago. So, a willingness to take big steps, but on the other side, a willingness to undo them very quickly as well. Some of our decision to wind things back as a country has also been dramatic, big, sort of overnighting. So those are kind of the elements, I think, that characterize Israel's response. A boldness in action, an equal boldness in, I guess, taking away those actions, and a kind of desire to show the world that we're the best at this.
I mean, I guess every country has been trying to strike this balance between stopping infection on the one hand and minimizing impact on the economy, and preventing people from working and going to school and kids going to school and that kind of thing. How is Israel's balancing of that differed from, say, the United States or Britain or other big democracies?
Well, look, particularly during the periods of high infection, countries around the world decided that there were certain things they had to do, like you said, to control the pandemic, to reduce cases. And there was a menu that they could choose from. Some things are more effective than others. Some things are more damaging to the economy or to the social fabric than others. Britain, for example, one of its big targets, what it thought was its low-hanging fruit, was stopping people from mixing in private houses. So for months in 2020, you could go to the shops, you could go to the pub, you could go to the restaurant, you could go to work, schools were open, but you couldn't have friends over in your house or family. Or at one point, you could have only 6 people even at your meeting, even outside. That was a very strict rule, but it only applied to one area of life. It was obviously mocked pretty roundly because you could go to the pub and sit in a room with your friends but not talk to them. It was a bit ludicrous. Israel chose another way. Only at the very strictest and highest points of our lockdown were we ever banned from having guests in our house. That was actually a few months at various points, but it certainly was like the last thing that was introduced and the first thing to go away. Because it's understood in Israel, a very family-oriented society, that was a really major restriction. On the other hand, on the flip side, the Israeli government has been very willing to close restaurants, for example, to close places of entertainment for months and months on end. There were periods where you could only eat outside, or restaurants with strict takeaway, because we have less of a pub culture in Israel, and that's not so important. Schools is another issue in many countries. Keeping schools open was an absolute priority, and often it was a big political controversy. In Israel, we actually kept schools closed an extremely long time, and Zoom, particularly for some years. I think the years of 14 to 15-year-olds, the last 18 months until the beginning of this academic year, barely had a month or two in the classroom. They tried to open Ganim for younger ages, but there were certain decisions that were based on what Israeli culture valued. Another example is protests, actually. There were several countries, the UK in particular, banned protests. Very strictly, they banned protests. People who went to protests were arrested, including one fairly significant protest against a woman who was murdered by a policeman, who I think was an ex-boyfriend or something. And the police came and arrested the people protesting against the police. Here in Israel, for all of the criticism the Netanyahu government then faced, actually, we didn't really ban protests. There was a real reluctance to do that because there was a sense that this was maybe a line too far. So then you get some sense,
including of course, weekly protests against the prime minister.
Yeah, I mean, mostly the weekly protests against the prime minister. Yeah. That was the big one. That was what everyone saw on television, and that was the one that everyone talked about. And look, again, this might be taking us a bit off the path this early on. I think there was certainly I think it was politically useful for Netanyahu actually to have the protests outside his house, because it meant that he could say, look, see, I'm not even banning that, and it maybe enabled a certain amount of anger to be directed towards the protesters that might otherwise have been directed elsewhere from some sectors of Israeli society. But I think there was a genuine reluctance on his part and on the part of the government as a whole to feel like, this is not something we're comfortable with culturally. This doesn't sit right with us. Yeah. Obviously in the United States, where the individual states, made their own decisions, but I don't think that, protests were pretty much always allowed as well. So then different societies choose different values. And I think that you can learn a lot about what was important to Israel by what it banned, what it allowed, and what it prioritized reopening.
Right. That's really interesting. What about, question that comes to mind is, Israel, I think, this is a point you make very, very interestingly in your piece, that Israel has certain structural advantages over other countries that enabled it to do certain things quite quickly and quite efficiently. But conversely, there were also Israel-specific problems that it faced particularly with regard to the two population groups that were particularly that had disproportionate numbers of, in cases early on at least, that the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab population. Can you speak to both of those points, the structural advantages and the specific problems?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, Israel came into this with some immense structural advantages over other countries. We're the only democracy of our size, I think, and that has a strong central government. We have a parliament of just one chamber, just 120 Knesset members. That's not very many at all. No second chamber, basically no regional government, municipalities that are quite weak with very limited powers, and a government that, because of its emergency powers framework dating back to the beginning of the state, can do actually quite a lot, even without the approval of the Knesset. And particularly over the pandemic, where there was a bunch of elections and there was times where the Knesset wasn't really sitting, there were periods where the government could just make decisions, and those decisions would be law. Some of that actually comes even before Israel. There are a bunch of public health laws that date back to the British Mandate that are still on the books. And some of the things that we see, I actually think the mask law, the Knesset never had to vote on masks because the masks were imposed to the public health law, as far as I understand. And the public health law, again, it predates Israel, and it gives the health ministry all sorts of powers to make public health regulations without having to ask anybody. So that made it a lot easier than countries where there'd be disputes and arguments between different levels of government, as you saw in the United States, we've seen in Europe, even to a degree in the UK. I think also to a degree in Australia right now, because the government could decide and it would happen, in theory. In reality, of course, the writ of the Israeli government doesn't necessarily run to every part of Israel, as we know. There are populations in Israel where there isn't necessarily much law and order. The police might not operate so well. Maybe the tax authorities don't tread so easily. We've seen from the crime wave, for example, recently in Arab towns, sort of organized clan-based crime. The Arab community maybe would really prefer it if there was a stronger state inside their towns. But the fact is that there isn't. That meant that actually some of these rules maybe were not so enforced. You went to Arab towns. I think there was a period where one of the coronavirus projectors, the czars, went into, I think it was actually in Jerusalem, it's a slightly different situation, but into East Jerusalem. I saw that all the shops were open in the middle of the lockdown and no one was doing anything because it was an area where the police didn't go. Right. A similar situation applies in Haredi towns too, where there are authorities, but the authorities in Haredi towns are mostly Haredi themselves. And there isn't necessarily much will to impose fiats from central government against the wills of the rabbis. And so we saw that the government struggled to keep yeshivas closed during the toughest parts of the lockdown, struggled to impose rules there that were being followed by the rest of the country, in particular as it came to things like shuls and funerals. And at a certain point, they kind of gave up and agreed, that yeshivas can stay open even during the lockdown because it wasn't worth the fight.
Was that also political in the sense there were Haredi parties in the coalition?
Yeah, I think it absolutely was. And obviously, from much of the first period of the pandemic, the health minister himself was Yaakov Litzman from the United Torah Judaism Party. The Haredim were key partners in the governments. And of course, there's also an election on. So there was an immense amount of leverage there as well. But I'm not sure that this government doesn't have any Haredi parties in it. I'm not sure that this government chose to enter into a lockdown situation, which I don't think is going to happen, that it would do things all that much differently. I'm not sure that it really can. This isn't something that's easy to just do. You need to have the people, the framework, the capability there. And of course, there's a third grey area of here, which is particularly the West Bank proper, the Palestinian Authority areas, where Israel's writ doesn't run at all. They're run by the Palestinian Authority of Abu Mazen, with Abbas. And they pretty much got all their COVID from us. But once they had it, Palestinian workers come into Israel, they go back, and the two populations, in terms of at least infection, are connected. So there were these kind of structural lacunae as well. So I know that's one piece. Coming back to the question more generally, Israel has some other advantages that are worth mentioning. The system we have of Kupot Cholim is extremely powerful. We have
just for those that aren't Israeli and don't know the Hebrew, can you explain what Kupot Cholim are?
So Kupot Cholim are basically something like the equivalent of American health maintenance organizations. They kind of function as insurers, although they are non-profits. Every Israeli citizen who's resident here is a member of one of the four of them, and you get all your all your sort of first line health services from them. There are certain things they don't run. They don't run the hospitals, and actually that has been a bit of a challenge in this pandemic. That most health services are provided through these kupot, but then when it comes to hospitals, they're a slightly different place in the system. But they are these four organizations. They're extremely centralized again. They keep all of your medical records in one place. They follow the person around, virtually speaking.
Right.
And through the Kobit, it's basically been possible for Israel to have extremely fine-grained information about a patient. So we can know every day how, because of the Kobit and because of the hospitals, and they connect to each other, how many people are in hospital with COVID, but also how old they or each one is, what their vaccination status is. Have they had COVID before? This is not information that is easily available in almost any other country. And that's meant that Israel has a much better idea of what's going on in the pandemic. And it's one of the reasons why people look to Israeli research, because we can often get there first. It's also how Netanyahu, as prime minister, was able to secure the deal that he did with Pfizer. He was able to get Israel early access to vaccines because he was able to say to Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, if you give us this, we'll be able to get you useful data. The whole world will know that your vaccine works because with Israel's data, we can prove it. If you give it to other countries, you won't be able to get anything as useful. And so ultimately that ended up helping us really well. Another piece here that I actually didn't write about in my article is that we were able to do a lot of testing, a lot of PCR testing, because we have labs here, and, we have Teva. We're able to pretty early on ramp up our testing, which is why Israel's still one of the countries that does the most testing in the world. And that puts us in a really good place to know what's actually going on too.
Okay. We're now at this point where here in Israel, like much of the world, obviously, because of the new strain, the Omicron strain, cases are going up exponentially, and no one quite knows how far the government's going to go. You just said now that you don't believe this current government's going to do another lockdown. I'll ask you about that in a second, but a full lockdown at least. But obviously, over the period of the corona of this corona period, there's been times, I think, when, especially when the first vaccine, when we were the first to have a vaccine, and Israel was held up as this sort of model. And there are other times when, frankly, Israel's statistics look pretty bad compared to some other countries. So, how would you sort of balance out? What kind of grade would you give Israel? What's it done well? What has it not done well?
I want to just share something for a second, if I can get this to work. I have to see in a second. It's here. Not sure this is going to work. We'll see. It's not playing nicely with my two monitors. Okay, is that working?
Yeah.
Yeah. We like to think of Israel being a highly vaccinated country. But if you look at this chart, it's a bit small here. But Israel is this one here, if you can see my mouse.
Yeah.
We aren't particularly at the moment a highly vaccinated country. Our vaccination program has significantly stalled. You can see we were really high up here in February, March, April 2015.
Yeah.
And then all these other countries start crossing us. First, it's the UAE, actually. They do really well. And by June, July, we're basically being lapped by, I just picked these countries. He could have put a lot of other countries up here, but I chose these ones. China, South Korea, Canada, a country that was, came into a lot of criticism for being very slow with its vaccination program. Australia, another country that people think of as having a really bad vaccination rate. Italy, Germany, the UK. We're only ever so slightly above the United States. Now, some of that is because Israel has a very young population who have not been eligible for vaccination. Although now, actually, kids 5 and above are eligible for vaccination. That's a significant proportion of the population. And here we are still stalled at 60-something%. That's not good.
How is that? Well, how do you
so just one more point.
Sure.
The same is true of boosters. We are no longer the country with the most boosters in the world. We've been lapped by the UK about a week and a half ago. And look at the shape of these lines. Israel, our booster program is not quite stalled, but it's not rising very fast. And I think we're going to see Germany, Italy, some of these countries are going to have done more boosters than us within a month, because we're just not reaching out further in our vaccination program. Now, I want to say that's actually a huge issue for Israel. It's an enormous problem. And it's why actually going into Omicron right now, we're not in as good shape as we look. Because in some of these other countries, they have 70, 80, 85% immunity. And we're hovering around 65, 70% once you factor in past infections. That's going to hurt.
It's interesting because I think for many of us who weren't maybe aware of that, weren't aware of that drop-off, we've been, speaking personally, I've been struck by how dramatic the statements by the Prime Minister and other government ministers have been in the last week or so, last couple of weeks, where they've been very, not, almost apocalyptic, but like very dramatic about, we're on the verge of a terrible situation. And what I imagine now, having seen this, is that they have these statistics in front of them and they see what you've shown us, that the country's actually really stalled in vaccines, and they're trying to get people to vaccinate through fear. I don't know if it's going to work.
No, I mean, even amongst the older age groups, amongst the over 60s, which is the kind of critical group you need to get to feel as a country quite protected from COVID, we're like stored on like 92, 93% vaccination. And that includes Lobotokef, so older vaccinations, more than 6 months without boosters. And it includes past infection, I think, as well. That's a lot of people who in theory could get sick. So that's one thing I think that Israel has not done well. And another thing I think we've been struggling with recently is maybe failing to appropriately calibrate our interventions. Like, the one thing we know about Omicron, for example, is that vaccinated people are much more likely to get it than they were with previous variants. They're not as protected, they're more likely to get it. They might not get so sick. It looks like they probably don't get sick by anything like the same rates, but they can give it to other people.
Right.
So is right now the time to expand the Tav Yarok to shops?
The green passport
system, the vaccine passport, is that the intervention that we need that will make a difference to anything? Like, I'm not sure. It doesn't seem to me to be really to the point. And again, I know you mentioned before, maybe I mention it later, the travel situation, but as well as another intervention that I think doesn't work.
Right. Do you think obviously there's been, I mentioned at the beginning, quoting you, that there's been elections and different governments during the whole course of this. We had the first real significant political change, obviously in May, June, with a new government, new prime minister, some significant changes, like, for example, no ultra-Orthodox in the coalition, a health minister who's not from the ultra-Orthodox, but rather actually almost the exact opposite, from a secular left-wing party, Meretz. Have there been significant differences, notable differences in policy or approach by this government? And I'll just point out, for those that aren't aware, Naftali Bennett, when he was not in government, when Netanyahu was prime minister, Bennett was very critical of the government's corona policy.
No, I don't think they have. And actually, Naftali Bennett in opposition, he made a bit of a name for himself as this kind of Mr. COVID for a few months.
Right.
It's a sort of short-lived thing, but he founded this People's Coronavirus Cabinet, and he published these chunky reports, which were all very shiny and at least superficially impressive. And I'll be honest, it had some good stuff in there, but it also had some not such good stuff. He, in government, you don't really see a difference in approach. I don't think. There's certainly no hard, new government's in, things are different. Even the previous government, there was a new government in the middle. There was the Netanyahu Gantz government, and I think you actually did notice a difference in the kind of short-lived Netanyahu Gantz coalition, and the much narrower Netanyahu-Haredi coalition that preceded it, there you did notice a difference. I think the difference between the Netanyahu-Gantz government and the current government is much harder to find, actually. But part of that is that, look, the politicians come in, but then they come into offices of professionals who are advising them and have their own interests. The finance ministry has always been against any kind of lockdowns or restrictions on businesses, no matter which minister's in, because they're the finance ministry, like finance ministries in basically every other country. The health ministry has always been supportive on the whole of more restrictions, no matter which minister's in, because they're the health ministry and they're like health ministries in other countries. The health minister, a bit different. The truth is that, what's his name? Health minister?
Nissan Horowitz.
Nissan Horowitz, as health minister, has actually been quite skeptical of restrictions. And I think part of that is that because Israel first started its restrictions under the Netanyahu right-wing government, there was a bit of a sense in some parts of the Israeli left that restrictions are right-wing, sort of the opposite of what you've seen maybe in the US, where, okay, Trump was the president, but lockdowns were seen as left-wing. I think there was some sense in like parts of the harder Israeli left that any kind of COVID restrictions are like a bit right-wing. And so like Horowitz's instinct is to be against them. Whereas Bennett in the Prime Minister's office, his instinct has actually been to be pretty hard line on restrictions. I think Bennett would go much further if he could, but he can't. Like, he doesn't have the votes in his own coalition. This is a government of 61, 60 really. And one of the members of the government, the education minister, Unvaccinated, is like very skeptical of any kind of COVID measures. And they just don't have the votes really. So I think that there's a kind of bit of a dance right now with this government, which is that they were, at least until a couple of weeks ago when thinking's changed, and maybe we'll talk about that later, in a place where, if Tony Bennett could decide on his own, I think we would have had some pretty serious restrictions over the last couple of weeks to prevent Omicron, but he can't right now. He doesn't have the political power inside his own government to make them happen.
Yeah. Okay, so one last question from me, and then I'm going to open it up. And we've already had some questions coming in. Israel, and this is obviously very relevant for, as I said, for this audience of Olim and people outside Israel with family in Israel. Israel seems to have adopted very tough, comparatively to other countries, I think, tough restrictions on international travel. Why do you think that is? And do you think and in your opinion, is it something that's actually effective and smart?
So one of the first measures that Israel did in the coronavirus pandemic very early on was to ban travel from Italy. And I remember this was before Italy had its disaster even, when the first couple of cases appeared in Italy in March, I think. And I remember being in my office and thinking, this seems like a massive overreaction. I must have misunderstood the story. And like, clearly it wasn't, but it was a tool that Israel used very early on, and I think felt like just became something that was the first restriction. I think there's a bit of a sense that the order in which we put restrictions on the first time is like the pattern. So obviously the first thing we do is limit travel, because that's what we did the first time. The last thing we do is a full lockdown. Somewhere in the middle we close restaurants, and so I think there was this sort of pattern thinking that got laid in. And there's also, it's very easy to ban foreigners, like politically.
Right. Nobody
really cares. Unfortunately, well, it's not true at all. Of course, the tourism industry is bleeding very hard, and Olim suffer. And people who aren't Olim, they have very close families abroad who aren't Israeli, suffer. But there isn't really a serious political pushback in the same way as there are for some other things. And most Israelis, they care about the red countries. They care about the fact that they're not allowed to go somewhere, but they don't care so much about foreigners, unfortunately. I do think, and I'll show you this slide if I can just put it up here. Just share the screen first and then push the slide button. Push the slide button. There we are. This graph shows in the last 3 months, the number of people coming. Sorry about the colors. There was no good way to get this to work. Otherwise, I had to just use the graph from the ministry directly. I tried to make it myself, but they gave me every country individually per day, and it was 15,000 lines, so it didn't work. This is the number of people that tested positive after they flew into Israel every day since the 1st of October. And the blue line at the bottom that's almost straight is foreigners. And the green line at the top, which is definitely not straight, is Israelis. So you can see that there are points where there were, the height the last couple of weeks where there were 400, 450 Israelis a day coming in. And certainly here you can see even 200-300 with COVID. And foreigners, you can't really see, 3 or 4. Over the period, it's at less than 8% of the cases that came in are foreigners. Now, obviously, that includes some period of time when the airport is, in theory, closed to foreigners, but most of this isn't the case. Most of this period here is not like that. So shutting the airport to foreigners, it made sense for a brief period when we were still trying to stop Omicron coming into the country.
Yeah.
But it didn't really matter because Israelis are still bringing it in. So I think that's a general problem that a lot of countries are struggling with right now. And Israel is no different, which is someone needs to do something, this is something, and therefore we should do it. Rather than matching the intervention to the benefit. Is it worth banning all foreigners to stop 8% of cases coming through the airport? I don't think so. I think it has zero benefit at all. I will say I spoke to a senior government official who told me that this was already a couple of weeks ago when the situation had to be different, but they felt they might have to put serious restrictions on the Israeli public, and the public wouldn't accept it if foreigners were still allowed in. But I don't know how much I believe that person or how much that's a post hoc justification.
Okay. Great. All right. Let's get to. Thank you very much for answering my question so fully. We're going to get to questions that have come in from our audience. Firstly, a very sort of simple one from Jacqueline, which is, what % of the people in Israel are still completely unvaccinated? Do we have that?
I don't have it. If you give me 30 seconds, I can tell you.
Okay.
Because the health ministry publishes this wonderful.
So while you're doing that, while you're just checking, let me just add on to that and say, can you say something about whether Israel has a prominent sort of anti-vax population in the way that the United States does and France does and some other countries don't seem to?
Well, I think it's about 35% completely unvaccinated. I need to look up the exact
including
number.
Children, of course.
But those are mostly children, and it gets less and less in every age group until you get up to the 90s plus, right, where for some reason you have a slight, I guess because there might be more people in that age group who are impossible to reach, more people in that age group who frankly have passed away, but their death isn't recorded in the system, so they don't exist. They look unvaccinated. But yeah, again, amongst the over 60s, it's 7%. And when you get to the 20s, I think it starts doing 15-20%. And then, for younger ages, it's much more. Right. So, your question, I forgot it.
Mike, it was just about, just briefly, do we have a significant anti-vax population?
So look, there's clearly a very loud and energetic anti-vax movement that lives mostly online. In fact, I should have bought it. And it's waiting for me in my mailbox, according to my neighbours. Anti-vax stuff was put through our mailboxes this morning, actually, conveniently enoh.
They must have known you were going to be on this thing.
Yeah, but I thought I would have brought it up. But it's just a sticker saying don't comply in Hebrew. I guess you're supposed to know what that means. But and there are Facebook groups and the public health officials behind the vaccination program have received threats, and it's that said. And by the way, I should note that some of the big Haredi rabbis who have supported vaccination are receiving threats inside the Haredi community, because there seems to be inside the Haredi community a very hardcore maybe quite small, but very extreme and hardcore, like anti-vax group as well. And I also have heard that there is, if not a campaign, at least a suspicion inside the Arab community about this vaccination in particular. And, the community that does use tipat khalab, does vaccinate their kids on the whole, Israeli Arabs. But, again, there's all the conspiracy theories just kind of got planted on this. All that said, I think the majority of people that have not got vaccinated are not anti-vaxxers. They're not conspiracy theorists. They're either people who are, they just don't, they think COVID is over. They're not very worried. They haven't got round to it yet. They're confused or conflicted. They're still waiting for a bit more information. And that's why I think that the government should be trying to vaccinate those people and convince them to get vaccinated rather than just doing more and more green passes in the hope that eventually they'll give in. Yeah,
I mean, I certainly think that the vaccinations, the reluctance to vaccinate children by the vast majority of people who are not vaccinating their children are not conspiracy theorists. They're people who have concerns about vaccinating their children. I think that's my experience anyway of friends of mine who haven't vaccinated their children.
Yeah, look, I mean, my wife was pregnant in the first trimester when pregnant women were eligible to be vaccinated. And we have this conversation. We're going to be, Israel's we're the first country offering vaccines to pregnant women. It's one thing to be against vaccines. It's another thing to be one of the first 50 women in the world, pregnant women in the world, to get the vaccine.
Right.
And so we waited a couple of weeks, and then we did it.
Yeah.
But I felt that's kind of a natural feeling to be a bit nervous, to not be sure. I think writing off all those people as evil anti-vaxxers doesn't help anybody.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So there's a couple of questions, similar questions about alternatives to the vaccine. LibShare refers to suggesting having the government open up to successful alternatives to the vaccine. There's a question by Ziv Share about the use of therapeutics in addition to vaccinations. Is the Israeli government doing enough to promote the use of therapeutics as an additional tool against COVID?
Oh, that's a good question. We were actually kind of slow on this in Israel. We were slow to start using monoclonal antibodies. A lot of these monoclonal antibodies don't really work against the Omicron strain anymore. So actually, that's one tool we had in our arsenal that is not so useful. I think of the 3 or 4 in the market, only one works against Omicron, and even that one not so well. And there's a big shortage. I don't know if we have any in Israel. But Israel was slow to start using monoclonal antibodies. It was even slower to start using remdesivir, which the kind of early antiviral, which does have a very minor but meaningful effect on COVID. Obviously, we Israel use the standard of care that has been developed in other countries. So we use dexamethasone steroid, which has a huge impact on outcomes for COVID patients. Now we're in a situation where there are 2 new drugs that have only really begun to be approved in the last couple of weeks. There's the Pfizer pill, Monopiravir, I can't remember how you pronounce it, it's Monopiravir, and then there's Paxlovid from Pfizer. Now, the first pill is, the Monopiravir is from Merck, sorry, no problem. Now, Paxlovid's amazing. It reduces serious severe COVID by 90%. And Israel is supposed to be getting a shipment of it very soon. Now, there's going to be a shortage of it because it takes 6 months to make, and there just aren't that many pills in the world. So the fact that we've got any is pretty good. The Merck pill is a lot less effective, it's 20-30%, 50% in unvaccinated people, but only 20-30% overall. And it's a muting. Basically, it's a pill that mutates the virus to kill it. Now, I probably don't have to tell you why mutating a virus to kill it could be risky. And there are some questions about whether or not it should be approved at all. And if it is approved, maybe it should only be used in very specific cases. So look, therapeutics, we use some, more coming, but they're not really, vaccination is still by far the best and most targeted intervention. These therapeutics are extremely new. They're much more experimental than the vaccines. They're bluntly much riskier than the vaccines. the Merck pill also can mutate human DNA, for example. Probably not a great thing. And like, you know, I think the answer is going to be a bit of both.
Okay, great. Question from Fern Rice. Hi, Fern. Good to have you on the Zoom. Fern asks, what could the Knesset do in terms of health policy were politics not a factor? And how might we help them enact these policies despite the politics involved? I guess a primary question that would be, do you think politics is a factor in inhibiting certain policies from being enacted?
Yes, I think politics is a factor. One very straightforward example would be, and it's beginning to happen now, but if it happened earlier, we'd probably be in a bit of a different place. It would be vaccinations in schools. That's something that the education minister put a lot of political capital into blocking. It's not only be vaccination with parents' permission, but they would be in school, so the parents don't have to take their kids somewhere. You know, so parents who didn't want to vaccinate their kids still wouldn't, but the ones who just haven't got around to it would, and it seems like that's actually a lot. That's something that, you know, it seems like there's probably enough goodwill in the country. Most parents don't. You have to be pretty extreme to think that there shouldn't be vaccinations in schools if you can opt out of them, or you have to opt into them, I should say. But that would, I think, would have changed the course of the pandemic if we'd have done it earlier, particularly for teenagers, where the vaccination rate's pretty low. And you know, Israel was actually quite slow to promote vaccinations in 12 to 15-year-olds. We said, you know, back in the earlier beginning of the summer, we said, oh, you're allowed, but no rush. And then obviously, you know, more recently, we've started to encourage it a bit more when the Delta wave happened. Trying to think what other things. Look, I don't support this particularly, but there hasn't been a debate in Israel, one way or another, about like vaccine mandates that we've seen in other countries. For maybe people who are working in frontline roles in particular, or, you know, for certain sorts of jobs outside of just teachers and healthcare professionals. There isn't really a formal vaccine mandate in Israel. And with a political will, maybe the Knesset would do it. But again, I'm not sure that is a good thing. On the other hand, in the US, it seemed to have actually worked quite a lot. And in some professions, you know, in some sectors, the vaccination rate went through the roof because of it. So yeah, that's actually something to think about. Yeah.
I know. Yeah, I personally know someone who only got his vaccination because he was teaching in a school and he didn't want to have to test himself every day. Otherwise, I think would not have got it. There's a question here: Is the Israeli scientific community designing a vaccine specifically against Omicron that you know
of? I think I heard something about that, but it's worth noting that Israel doesn't really have yet an approved and deployed vaccine even against the wild strain. No, vaccine development is not our strength. Bluntly, you know, Israel's technology has a lot of strengths in technology, but like biotech innovation is not at the top of the list. And there are places that are better than ours. You know, Teva, most famously, is a generic manufacturer. They kind of make other drugs that have gone out of patent. That said, there's a question about, and it's not clear whether an Omicron-specific vaccine is a good idea or not. Omicron is new. It descended from the original virus. It didn't descend from Alpha, you know, the British variant, or from Delta, the Indian variant. So whereas the kind of raw original vaccine gives us some protection against everything, it's not clear that an Omicron-specific variant would give us protection against future variants. So there's a bit of a debate about that. You know, people are kind of going one way or the other about whether or not we should have an Omicron vaccine at all.
Yeah. Okay. There's a question from Robin, an interesting question about, I guess it relates to the point right at the beginning about Israel's structural advantages, or at least structural differences to some other countries. Obviously, we think of Israel as having this very powerful, well-developed, well-resourced military and also intelligence services, which we think of usually in the security realm. But how has Israel deployed the army and its intelligence services in the fight against COVID, and how has that gone down with the population?
That's a really interesting question, and it takes us back to politics. I think that in the early days of the pandemic, not even that early, there was actually an obvious role for the military in Israel, and which is a society which is maybe somewhat more accepting of the military having kind of civilian support roles. But the government didn't use it because at that point the defense minister was Naftali Bennett, and Netanyahu did not want to give Bennett anything at this point. And in fact, Bennett, as defense minister, was extremely loud in saying that the military should have a role in helping and giving up all these things that it could be. And Netanyahu was essentially saying, no, we're not going to allow that. Then afterwards, the defense minister was Benny Gantz. And there was something of a similar picture, actually, although there was a bit more willingness in the Netanyahu-Gantz government to allow the military to have some, particularly the Picud Oref, the Homeland Guard. How would you translate that? I don't know how else. The home front command, maybe. Home front command. To help with COVID testing, some of those things. At one point, there was a talk about whether the military should build field hospitals, but actually, thankfully, it's never been needed. So that hasn't happened. So now actually there is a role. And at one point, a few months ago now, I think, the Picud Oref sites, the home front testing sites, for COVID tests were scrapped. But then it quickly turned out that we needed them, so they were reinstated within just a week or two because they've actually become a vital part of Israel's pandemic management by managing the PCR tests outside of the Kobit. When it comes to other things, most famous, of course, is the use of the Shin Bet security service's phone tracking technology to tell people if they've been near a COVID case and operate the isolation system. Now, this was extremely controversial when it was introduced by the Netanyahu government. It was also a bit of a failure because you couldn't necessarily tell how high you were. I have friends who lived in apartment blocks who, because someone, was 5 floors above them with a COVID case, they got a thing saying you'd been next to them. I have friends who got an alert sending them to be doed, and the time that they were supposed to have been in contact with another person was when they were in a car on their own driving to work. It was extreme. The truth is, it was very worrying for a lot of people I know who what if we get this text, even though we haven't gone anywhere or done anything? The government boasted that this was extremely successful and stopped X number of infections. I'm quite dubious about it. I also suspect, and I don't know if I should say this, why not? It's already been scrapped. I don't think that actually that system ever went anywhere. I think if you got one of these texts telling you've been near a COVID case, report yourself immediately on the health ministry website, I don't think that they knew who, I certainly didn't hear of a case of someone who got the text, didn't report themselves and then got in trouble. I think it was to
scare people into
I think it was to scare people into compliance. No, I might be wrong. Don't count on me. If they ever bring it back and you do this and go to prison, that's your fault, not mine. But that's my gut feeling.
Okay.
More recently, they talked about just using it to enforce quarantine, but at the moment, as far as I know, this is not enforced. The Attorney General said it's not okay. The courts didn't like it, and the Knesset declined to give it ongoing authorization.
Okay. So this takes us to a question from Shmuel Yerushalmi, who asks about. He wants to know what the government, what policies could be implemented to enforce the restrictions. Like, it's all very well having these restrictions, but what about enforcement? The fact that you go on the bus and there's people without masks, all that kind of thing. Like, what can the government do, do you think, realistically, to enforce things better?
It's a very difficult question. because ultimately the only way to enforce things is to have enforcers. Either you flood the streets with police and give everybody fines. One thing at various points in the pandemic, the government tried to put the city municipalities, the Iliot, in charge of enforcing certain bits of COVID rules. For example, restaurants. Instead of the police shutting down a restaurant that wasn't supposed to be open, the municipality was supposed to shut it down. But municipalities kind of like, they want their business fees and they don't necessarily care about the central government. Here in Jerusalem, instead of shutting down restaurants, the city government went and put tables outside them. So they can say, oh, technically you're not really having outdoor dining. These are public tables. These are from the city. It's like they're on a bench. And so that was kind of a bit of a failure in various ways, because the people who were supposed to be enforcing the rules supported breaking the rules. And some of the enforcement that we did see, was famously, people being jumped upon, sitting on a park bench during a lockdown, and it was 150 meters from their house and being given a fine. Part of the problem, of course, was that the fines were extremely disproportionate. There were the Arab towns got fines at a much higher rate than the rest of the population, and the Haredi towns at a much lower rate. So I don't have an easy answer for that. I kind of feel like there are pretty much only two approaches to this. Either you need to be draconian, which means police everywhere, tracking, trample down civil liberties, or you need to rely on the citizens to do the right thing. And I think the middle ground is, maybe you're going to find that you probably won't, doesn't necessarily work. Right.
So just looking forward now and dealing with the situation we currently have with Omicron. So Jacqueline asks, she says that as Omicron is so infectious, is Israel looking to herd immunity from a combination of natural infection and vaccination? And similarly, Svi says that the American media often cites an Israeli study showing that natural immunity of people who have had COVID is as good or better than that of the vaccine.
Okay, so we'll start with the first one. Yes, natural immunity. I like to call it natural immunity. It's not natural, but infection-induced immunity is pretty good. And Israel has always acknowledged that. And by the way, so do most European countries. The US is a bit of an outlier, which is why you could get a green pass with the infection-induced immunity. You didn't need to have 2 vaccine doses, or even one. You just needed to have had COVID. Yeah. And that was considered in Israeli terms vaccine. And in fact, in Israeli media, when we talk about the word that we use for vaccinated is mechussan, which means something immune, like protected or immune. Yeah. And often in Israeli health terms, we don't distinguish when we say mechussan between people who've been vaccinated and people who have recovered. That term sometimes applies to both. That said, it was even a few months ago that Israel noticed that infection-induced immunity also wanes. And so it said that if you had a COVID before, you still have a limit on your green pass. Maybe you'll need to get a booster to keep your immunity high. And one thing that we have seen in the last couple of weeks as Omicron begins to spread is that Omicron doesn't care very much about previous infection either. And we've seen a big jump in daily cases. You see something like 1% of daily cases of people who've had it before. I think we're up to about 7% of daily cases are recovered, which isn't terribly far away from the 10 to 12% of Israelis that we know have had it. So don't be too surprised if infection-induced immunity seems to be doing very little for against Omicron. Which brings us to the next question about Omicron. There's a bit of tension in the Israeli government, just like I think most governments, about Omicron right now. I think it goes in a bunch of different ways. We know it's crazy infectious. No one's arguing about that. We know that on average, people who get it will have less bad outcomes than they had with previous variants. But partly that's because most of the people who are getting Omicron were immune to other variants. So, if you had 100 people, say, and 10 of them catch Delta, and 3 of them become serious, that's one thing. With Omicron, maybe you have 100 people and 50 of them catch it, and 4 of them become serious. Now, obviously, that's a much lower rate. 4 in 50 is much less than 3 in 10. But you've got 4 people who are sick instead of 3. And that's the reality. And they've got 4 people, right? So this is the kind of challenge that everyone's trying to figure out all around the world. To what extent do we need to worry that the very, very fast spread, even with a milder illness, could lead to health services collapsing? To what extent do we need to worry, even with a milder illness, potentially, of like mass casualties? So I think a couple of weeks ago, Israel was definitely heading towards we need to be very scared of Omicron. Now, looking at other countries, looking at how they're handling it, looking that it's bad, but it's not worse than previous waves in hospital outcomes. Maybe there's a bit of a sense of, well, the only options are a full, very strict lockdown to stop this very fast spreading virus, or accepting that we can't stop this very fast spreading virus. And maybe middle ground options are not a smart way to go. That said, at the moment, obviously the government has chosen middle ground options. Right now there is now a green pass in big shops. There's now a green pass in shopping mall and malls, which they then only let you into some shops, and new sorts of restrictions on schools that didn't exist a week or 2 ago. And on the flip side, they've changed the rules about how quarantine works for Omicron until the last few weeks. People who maybe had been exposed to the Omicron variant had to do a full isolation. Now they don't. They just have to do a test on day 1, isolate for a few hours until they get the result.
If they're vaccinated.
If they're vaccinated, sorry, absolutely, vaccinated or recovered. So yeah, obviously, particularly for kids, that's an issue. So I think the government doesn't really know yet. There was a story floating around on Channel 12 that some in the health ministry are thinking about some kind of a herd immunity strategy. I don't think it's going to happen officially. I don't think the government's ever going to say, everyone go out, have fun, get sick. But I think in reality, that might be the direction we're heading in, because it doesn't really seem like there's any other plan.
Right, because the only other alternative is like super hard draconian, and we're probably not going to do that either, right?
And even if we do that, then what? Do it forever? If everyone's going to get sick anyway, then they'll get sick anyway. Right? The only reason to flatten the curve is to stop the health system being overloaded. But when you flatten the curve, the area under the curve stays the same, right? The same number of people get sick in the end. So, do we want 9 months of Omicron with the same number of people getting sick when we can have it in 6 weeks? I don't know. And look, all of this is based on very early preliminary figures, disease figures from South Africa, from the US and the UK, and they could all change. There's still so much we don't know about this. And
right. Okay. Arieh, I want to thank you very much for a really enlightening and detail-packed presentation and answering my questions and everyone else's questions. I have written in the chat the link to Arieh's fantastic article at the Tel Aviv Review of Books. Or if you didn't see the link, you can just go to the Tel Aviv Review of Books and Google Arieh's name, Arieh Kovler. I've also written my email address in there, paulg@begincentre.org.il, for those of you who are not receiving my emails and not on my mailing list and would like to be, amongst other things, I will be sending out the YouTube link to this event, to this talk, which you can send out to friends and family. And if you arrive late and miss some, you can also catch what you missed. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you so much, Arieh, for being with us and for helping us understand this extremely complicated and troubling situation a little better. And thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody.